Hi, this is Paul, and I just finished part one of the treatment of Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro on the Rubin Report. That was the last day of November 2018, where Peterson really, I think, got a lot more concrete on some things. And the section that I treated began with a question from Dave Rubin about, Peterson, you get so esoteric, and I doesn't want to answer the belief question, but acts as if, and all of that. And why can't you just talk simple for simple folks? Now, and then I talked a lot about representation, how language is an attempt to represent reality, to represent a lot of things. Language is an attempt to represent things in words, and words have meaning in relation to one another. This meaning goes, whenever we use language, we tap into this long history of not only the English language, which I'm using now, but families of languages, and these go all the way back, and they have psychological roots and all of those things. And the question that has been stalking Peterson with a lot of this stuff is, of course, the church. Now, part of what happens is that churches and theological traditions are histories of language and community, okay? And histories of language and community, and histories of representations within language sometimes, in some communities, in art, in music, in sculpture, in architecture, in literature, in lots of different things, okay? And that all gets embodied. And so what we dealt with God number one and God number two, I mentioned that, Peterson talks in the previous video I did about the spirit of masculinity. Well, what is that spirit? What do we mean by spirit? And talked about the fact that when the king and the queen marry, the cleric, the priest, the minister says God brought them together. So God is an incredibly small-handed representation of all of that stuff, all the way down into a tiny little three-letter word. Okay, that's in a sense what's happening when we do this. Now, Jonathan Peugeot, in his November question and answer, he at the end of his question and answer said, "Oh, I had all these rants, but I like his rants." Sometimes when we rant, we get very clear about things because we're motivated and we get our blood up, and our mind gets focused, and then suddenly we can put things together that we've only been just kind of trying to cobble together before. And he has a rant which, when Jonathan Peugeot shared this, I really laughed, because I had exactly the same experience. Sometimes people will watch my videos and they'll come and visit Living Stones, and they'll be like, Paul at Living Stones isn't exactly like Paul in the video. I mean, Paul in the video is talking about Jordan Peterson and all the Peterson stuff, but when Paul gets into church, he sounds more like a regular minister, and he's doing regular Bible things. And what is that about? Well, I completely understand why there's a disconnect. And what there is a disconnect in representation. And I'm gonna jump into Jonathan's little rant in this, because I thought it was nice to have someone else live it, and actually pastors live this kind of thing all the time, because people often want me to talk politics. Well, politics is another aspect of representation, and it's a very applied aspect, and it's a very, well, here's the funny thing about politics. Politics is always very much lives in the now. Theology lives over very long times, okay? And that's why so often when ministers get very political, well, they're cutting off the branch that they're sitting on, because ideally ministers should be able to their product should be able to go through time and be able to use broadly throughout time. But when ministers get very political, they dilute everything they're doing just kind of into the thin now, whereas longer theological traditions go long. So in a sense, when people come in and they expect my sermons to be something like my conversations about Jordan Peterson, I would say, no, my sermons are are dealing with this community, dealing with very old representations that have all been built down into things. Now, what happens when people go to church and they work on this? Well, the community has taken all of this stuff and distilled it and compacted it and brought it down into very tight representations. Now, the difficulty that we have is that as these representations go through time, the relationships they have with other things sometimes get lost, sometimes get sort of outdated. But if it's really good theology, it will actually be able to connect in with things that are today. This is where you get into archetypes, and Peterson talking about archetypes. One of the best questions I heard from a student in one of Peterson's lectures was a student asking, why can't you tell the perfectly archetypal story? Well, because it's like saying, why can't you represent for me the perfect human being? Well, a Christian might say, well, Jesus is the perfect human being. And some smart person might say, but Jesus is a first century person who was raised in the Galilee and died in Judea. And this is where you get into Aristotle and a lot of conversations about four causes. There's a really, I'm not too, incarnation. We are here in a particular moment, and we try to transcend those moments, and that's what a lot of these old representations do. But you can't have a purely archetypal story without skin on it. And so when, let's say, you look at Star Wars very much followed Joseph Campbell. And in fact, when I did a sermon on the first two chapters of Jonah, I compared the first two chapters of Jonah with the Star Wars story. And someone had, I think it was Schroeder, I think, had kind of discerned, put it down into the story circle, which is another representation of what Joseph Campbell and Jordan Peterson and a bunch of these guys have been doing with. But you need to have skin on it, and that's what it means to be a Christian today. I need to be like Christ, and Christ is my model, but I am here in this time and space. Now I'm going to get into that in terms of the Peterson-Shapiro conversation, because that's where they go with it. But I want to begin with Jonathan Pageau's rant on this, because he says something really important for those of you who want to get connected into a bigger story and maybe begin to try to transcend your local time and space.
How can I say this? Okay, I know this might be hard for some people to think, to understand, but this stuff that I'm talking about, this symbolism stuff, I never talk about this with anybody. I don't talk about this. I talk about this with you guys. I put these on YouTube for people who are interested in discovering this, and I figure the subject is difficult enough, and it's strange enough, and it's kind of obtuse enough that only people who are really interested in this will even have the capacity to pay attention and watch my videos. But if I go to church and I meet the little old lady, who's there, who I don't know, came from Russia 5 years ago, I have no interest in questioning her assumptions at all, because those things, they in everyday life, they don't matter.
Yes and no. I'm not disagreeing with John. This isn't a rant. He's saying they don't matter. And what we're really saying is that when you're dealing with someone in your church who has no idea who Jordan Peterson isn't into the symbolic world, isn't into any of this, they are incarnated in different forms. And the particular representations that we are using here on YouTube with these conversations, that is over here. And the little old lady from Russia, Jonathan goes to a church with a lot of Russian immigrants. The little old lady from Russia, she's dealing with an entirely different package of representation. Are they connected? Yes. And that's where you get into this idea of archetypes. And that's where you get into, well, how is Harry Potter connected to the Bible? And, Peterson is dead on right. And that evangelical Christians who somehow sometimes are really bad at art fail to understand, oh my goodness, Harry Potter is kind of a Christ figure. in what's happening in that story. Okay, there's magic, blah, 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 blah. There was in the Chronicles of Narnia too. But we trusted C.S. Lewis, so on and so forth. But there's those connections. Now, most people don't pay attention to those connections because they are living their life. That's where Dave Rubin's question began in the section that I started the last video with. People are out there living their life. How does this relate? Jordan Peterson rose because the moment was right for him with all kinds of stuff going on, and he had a good understanding of those relationships. And so what he did was was able to show relationships between a lot of different people in a lot of different countries living their lives. And it's probably not going to be most people that listen to Jordan Peterson or care about this stuff because they are just too busy living their lives. And that's part of the reason that most of the people watching this and many of the people who follow my YouTube channel have jobs where they can sit down and absorb a lot of content. That's just the way it is, and I know that about my audience. So, but as Peugeot is saying, now, all of this stuff then is represented and distilled into, in Jonathan Peugeot's element, the Eastern liturgy, okay? And so they're dealing with all that, but with very different representations that the community they've in a sense learned the language of the liturgy. And just like someone who goes to a different country has to learn the language, and not just the language, but the customs, because the language and the culture are deeply intertwined. When you go to another church, you're going to have to learn the language. And what's tended to happen in the church is that, so you've got the Orthodox Church that is embedded and has maintained this long language tradition. The Great Schism, you have the Roman Catholic Church. They've maintained their own long language tradition. So you've got, in a sense, the Greek and the Latin. And then what happens in the Reformation is that speeds change, and the church, in a sense, goes into different speeds and gets a whole lot more accommodating, often at the expense of the longer stories. And that's part of what we see in the Protestant churches.
What really matters is how we are with each other. What really matters is how we're able to engage in the life and be transformed as people, and transform others, not in the sense of transforming the way they think, first of all, but transforming each other in the way we act towards each other and the way that we engage with each other.
Now, I had made the point that in the previous video that these representations, the verbal representations that I'm doing that we're able to transmit via YouTube, and there's a visual representation of me here that is also a part of the package. Some of you are just listening to it on audio. When we act, there are more layers of representation going on, okay? And so that's why, for example, in the New Testament, whenever there's a judgment day story in the New Testament, we're always judged about what we do. And this is why Peterson says, I act as if, because Peterson understands that acting is a deeper form of representation than just saying. And actually, the book of James gets into this, because the book of James sets up the contrast of, you see a poor person, you say, go off and be well, but you need to act, because acting has more layers of representation. It's more real than just talking, and we have that in all kinds of proverbs. Talk is cheap, okay? Actions speak louder than words. We have all this stuff built into our language and built into our proverbs. And so what Peugeot is saying here is that all of the liturgy has been built into the lives of the people. And what the liturgy does is orient people in the world. Now again, the different traditions work at different speeds. And so Protestants will tend to be a little bit more direct, and now we're going to get into this when I get into the, I got to keep my eye on the time. I've still got honeydews I have to get done with today because Monday I'm leaving town. Let's let him talk, and then we'll jump to the other video.
Now, once you're there for several years, and once you're there for a long time in that church, you will have deciphered the people in the parish, in your actual church, who have the interest and the capacity to talk about symbolism, who have the interest and the capacity to understand things at a more deeper level, and to to go further, and then you can engage those people in discussion, and you can hash it out with them as much as you want.
Now, in a sense, what he's saying that there's a hierarchy, but we shouldn't look at this as a simplistic elitism, because one of the things that you discover as a pastor or a Christian who's involved in a church is that some of your greatest saints might not have the gift to represent their sainthood in words. And someone, let's say someone like me, who perhaps has a gift of representing things in words, might, in terms of my own life, be lower down a hierarchy of sainthood than someone who can't explain. Some of you might know, if you look at the Freddie and Paul show, Philip Fast is in a lot of those videos, and Philip Fast, his gift is not in language. He makes these little Jesus signs, and he likes to put them all over, and he does that. And his sainthood, although for him, his Jesus signs is a big part of his ministry, the spiritual maturity that I see in Philip Fast is not in his ability to articulate things, it's in his ability to serve. And that's why in churches we have these things called spiritual gifts. And spiritual gifts mean that I might have the ability to articulate. That is a gift that God has built into me. He's built it into me biologically, God 1 and God 2. He's built it into me biologically, and I'm using my gift. But Philip Fast has the gift of service, and Philip Fast will rebuild someone's kitchen or pick someone up for church every Sunday, and so depends on the hierarchy. Now, Jonathan Bachot is saying once you start becoming part of a body of Christ, you might discover that there are other people who are also interested in the symbolism, and you can have a conversation. My Jordan Peterson meetups are just people who have found each other to have these kinds of conversations. Doesn't mean that they're saints or not saints. It just means that this is the level at which they are meeting and doing things. And what Jonathan is saying is that, and we're going to get into this in terms of the conversation with Peterson and Shapiro, Christ is the ideal representation. This is true of Protestants. This is true of Catholics. This is true of Orthodox. And Jordan Peterson does not go to church. Jordan Peterson has not been around a lot of church people. Ben Shapiro is a Jew. He knows the Jewish community. He doesn't know the Christian community. Dave Rubin, I don't know if he goes to church anywhere at all or has much experience in it. It's not being irresponsible to not know what you can't know. Okay, so the intricacies of these conversations between traditions is its own area of knowledge that nobody in that group is particularly aware of. But what Jonathan is saying is that if you go into a church, you might not talk Jordan Peterson-ish at all, but what you are is embodying the truth in different ways. Some have the gift to speak truth, some have the gift to live truth. And again, that's way, way more complex than that little sentence indicates, because again, even use of the word truth, well, very quickly you begin to discover that, well, that's a very complex thing going on when we're talking about truth. Let's get to the end of Jonathan's rant.
But it's really, really okay for the little old lady and for most people in churches to not have a intellectually deep understanding of this stuff. They don't have to. They need to understand it to the extent that it changes their life, and to the extent that it helps them get closer to other people in their community, and makes them want to pray and want to engage in the spiritual life. But that's what matters, guys.
And even the spiritual life. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, what is the spiritual life? Again, in the previous video, we talked about the spirit of good masculinity. Well, the spirit of life is this difficult thing to express that actually orients us and enables us to understand, see, pursue, and climb up hierarchies, to become better Christians, to serve each other better, to love each other more. Now love doesn't come up much in the conversation with Shapiro and Peterson and Rubin. And that actually was brought out in a Twitter conversation that Esther O'Reilly was tweeting quite a bit about yesterday. And that's an issue with Peterson. And whereas, sometimes Peterson will talk about love because, well, Jesus, when you have a hierarchy of the law, Jesus says, you can summarize the law in 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. What do you mean by God? What do you mean by loving God? What does it look like to love God? Well, as a Christian, I would say caring for this planet is part of loving God. Taking care of my dog is part of loving God. Love your neighbor as yourself. See, loving God is the top one because actually your neighbor is built into that. All right. And it gets represented in action. I can say love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But if I actually do something for my neighbor and meet my neighbor when that neighbor is in need, well, that is loving God without words. Now, words have their place and their importance, but that's where you get into this. Now let's jump back to this video, which is the primary one, and let's go on from there.
With whatever moral subset you create yourself, but that I think ultimately you're both making the argument that at a macro level, a society just can't
You can't function without the mythos. No, you're embedded in that. And so, well, and I was talking about this.
So in other words, this mythos, what does it mean by that? It means the orientation, the story, the big story. You can't function because these big stories govern. And this actually gets into before Dave Rubin's question about, boiling it down for people who perhaps don't have the education or aren't gifted in terms of articulating these things. Peterson's saying, and they were talking about the Enlightenment as the fruit of Christianity, not a departure from it.
Christian idea too. So I've been thinking about that statement about no one comes to the Father except through me. And I thought, okay, well, what does that mean exactly? And I've worked a lot of this out over these lectures that you and I have been participating in. Well, so there is this notion, and that Haidt and Lukianoff are also pursuing in the coddling of the American mind, that one of the ways that you ennoble people and encourage them is by having them confront things that are frightening to them, that are beyond them. So what you really want to do is you want to optimally challenge people. And what that does is make them braver and stronger, not less afraid. It makes them more courageous and more competent. Okay, and I would say the clinical evidence for that is overwhelming. If you poll 100 educated clinicians and you say to them, well, is there utility in having people get their ethical story straight and face the things that they're avoiding? They're all going to say yes, those are fundamentally curative.
And this is quite literally what we're doing the reverse of at college.
Yes, exactly. It's quite literally the reverse of that. Yeah. Okay, so now here's the idea. Here's the idea. So imagine that you are in some sense the embodiment of that paternal spirit that has characterized mankind since the dawn of time. It's locked in you. It's part of your potential. And maybe that's coded at least in part biologically, but it's also coded sociologically. It's in the air, so to speak, around you, in the mythos and in the stories we tell each other. Okay, so now what you decide to do, and this is where I think we could have an interesting conversation about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. So there's an idea in Christianity, which is, I think, the central idea, which is that you need to face the potential for malevolence that exists within you and in the world. So
okay, now he just, when he says, I think this is the central idea, okay, he just created a hierarchy, and he's saying, put that up top. I would assert that's not the central idea. That's an important idea. That's a good idea. Well, what would you say the central idea is? Well, where might we find the central idea? Well, we might find the central idea from, I don't know, Christianity, Jesus. Let the Sunday school kids say it. They'll know. Ask any children's sermon, what's the answer to every question? Jesus. Well, what does Jesus say the central idea is? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I'm not saying this to say Peterson gets it wrong. I'm saying this because when Peterson says he thinks this is the central idea, this gives us an indication of what Peterson thinks is central to Christianity. Gives us an idea of the shape of what he's seeing. And again, let's go back and listen to it again, but I just wanted to note that.
That's fake. So there's an idea in Christianity, which is, I think, the central idea, which is that you need to face the potential for malevolence that exists within you and in the world. So that's Christ's confrontation with the devil in the desert.
So again, when Peterson, this is where Peterson struggles as an exegete, because the temptation in the desert is a very important story. It's very small in the Gospel of Mark, but it's extensive in Matthew, Luke, and John, and it has a role in the story. Now, I don't know that it has the pivotal role in the story that Peterson has, but this is, again, is when we're trying to represent very big things and complex things, like even an entire religion, we're trying to distill it, and we're working a hierarchy, and we're trying to figure out what to put at the top. Well, then suddenly we're looking at all the evidence and saying, well, I think this is more it, and I think that's more it. So that's the nature of the conversation that we're having. Now, again, don't have a low resolution view of what I'm doing here. I'm just simply saying this is actually the work of theology and argument, and saying, okay, how can we represent an enormously complex thing and get it very simple so that people can grasp it, and so then that representation and that hierarchy can then orient us to have other conversations. That's what we're doing.
With Satan in the desert. You have to come to terms with that malevolence. That's part of existence. And you have to voluntarily accept the burden of suffering. And so that's the acceptance of the cross. Okay, so you take on that, you say the suffering, so there's an idea that Christ is a messianic figure because he took the suffering of the world onto himself. And what that means to me is that he was someone, speaking conceptually, who decided that the suffering of the world was his responsibility.
Now in a sense, implicit in what Peterson doing here is he's already moving with his assertion of the Jesus as role model. Okay, this has a very long history in theology. To what degree is Jesus role model? To what degree is Jesus representation? The book of Colossians, the Apostle Paul says he is the icon of the invisible God. Okay, so now we've got all of these elements, and we're going to try and put them in a hierarchy. All right, so what Peterson tends to do is just put role model at the top of the hierarchy, and that move is actually going to set up the conversation that he's going to have with Ben-Shapiro. Now, in every Christian tradition, Jesus is the ideal man. Jesus is our role model in every tradition. But then the nuanced question tends to be, well, how does that fit in the hierarchy? And I would say that that is always true in every Christian tradition, but a lot depends on the context, because usually hierarchies move quite a bit. Elements in them move depending on the context. For example, if I am going to, one of the honeydews I had to do this morning was unload a bunch of wood from my truck. So I unloaded a bunch of wood. Well, what is up at the top of the hierarchy? Well, when I'm driving the truck, it's certain elements are at the top of the hierarchy. Then I park the truck and I'm unloading the wood. Other elements are at the top of the hierarchy depending on what I need at the moment. And a lot of the questions that Shapiro and Peterson are going to be wrestling with here are sort of like that. Which aspect of Jesus do you need to show up at the moment? Sometimes, perhaps, role model will be the one that shows up. Sometimes, in fact, hero and rescuer, deliverer will be at the top of the hierarchy. A lot depends on the context and the moment that you're in and what the particular thing is called for. And again, this gets into Peterson in terms of world of objects or form for action. Within a form for action, the reality of forms for action is that hierarchies get shaped up depending on what the need is in the moment. All right?
And that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to decide that that's your responsibility. You take that on as a burden. You do the same with the malevolence. So when you read history, you read history as a perpetrator, right? Maybe you also read it as a victim, but you certainly read it as a perpetrator. And then that's on you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then the question is, what happens when you do that? And I would say the answer is two things, is that, first of all, it starts to force you to develop, like to learn what you need to learn in the world and to absorb the information that would enable you to start to face the suffering and to rectify it. So that forces you to become a more competent person, and that's the socialization part that you thought of as so important. But then there's a secondary thing that happens too, which is that taking on that additional stress and demand voluntarily transforms you biologically, because within your genetic structure, let's say, there's all sorts of potential. But that won't be unlocked unless you place yourself in a position where the demands necessitate it. And so by following that pathway, truth, let's say, the acceptance of suffering and the confrontation with malevolence, so that's the heaviest load that you could take on, then you actually produce a psychophysiological / spiritual transformation in yourself that matures you into like the representation of the Father on earth. That's why that's how that lays itself out.
And again, I think that is what Peterson just lays out there. I think is a terrific representation of an aspect of Christianity. But the context of that will determine. That's just one aspect, and there are multiple aspects, and often that which is needed is determined by the context. There are moments when, as a Christian, you have to stop and say, I have to take upon myself the responsibility and deny myself and suffer for the sake of the good of the world. There are times when Christians slip into that role as little Christs. C.S. Lewis writes about that. Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, long through the Christian tradition, in some senses, Christians take on that role. There are other times, however, when we realize where we are on other hierarchies, and, well, what do we do then? Well, then we look for a champion. Then we look for someone else in our community. And this is where Peterson's individualism starts to not be as much of an asset. Then we look for someone else in our community and say, well, Paul might be able to do this, but Rick might be able to do that. And so we're going to put Rick up higher in the hierarchy. And now, again, Jesus is at the top of the hierarchy. There are dragons that will eat me, but they won't eat my hero. And that's why, as I said in the previous video, what Peterson said before, that's why men will defer to other men and put other men up higher in the hierarchy, because Jesus will handle things I can't. And so then I will bow and worship and make myself subservient to Jesus, because Jesus is stronger. Jesus has more power. And again, when you look at the Gospels, a lot of this stuff is represented.
I'm glad he got us here, because the question that I said to you, there was only one thing I said to you guys before we started, that I wanted to get to something about most of the lectures that when we're doing these things, you're usually talking about the Old Testament. Now, obviously, you're an Old Testament guy.
I'm fond of it.
But my question was, do you think that Ben, or just people that believe in the Old Testament exclusively, are missing something? So you just laid out a case of something that potentially is missing there. Do you think that is a fair argument?
Well, what I'm going to argue is that what you just said is fundamentally unchristian, in the sense that you're saying that everyone is supposed to imitate Jesus. And the basic conceit of, from what I understand, speaking with Christian theologians, is that we are fundamentally incapable of taking on our own sin. And so we have to have somebody who comes in the form of Christ on earth in order to accept that suffering for us. And that is the purpose of God actually embodying himself in Christ, is to provide human beings the capacity to withdraw from original sin, that we don't actually have the capacity beyond a certain point to overcome. And that's why Jesus as a singular figure is necessary.
Okay. And in a sense, Shapiro just finished saying something similar to what I just said. But now Christianity is not a simplistic ideology. Christianity is a fully worked out religion. And let's think about Jordan Peterson's very famous story about when he was going to have a fight on the playground with one of his little friends, and his mother walks by, and his mother looks at the situation and keeps walking. And Peterson says, "Good on you, Mom," because she knew that little Jordan and whoever this other little kid was, they need to rough it up and they need to deal with this. Now, let's say, however, that, I don't know, an adult was on the field, and or the other kid's mom was on the field, and Jordan starts getting it in with the other kid, and the mom steps in and starts beating the crap out of Jordan. Well, Jordan's mom, she'd step in. Well, how would she step in? Well, she might call the police. She'd probably step in physically, because at this point, if, let's imagine 7 or 8, I don't remember the details of the story, but if the kids are 7 and 8, a fully grown woman can take on an 8-year-old boy, no problem, generally speaking, depending on the boy, depending on the woman, so on and so forth. But in that case, mom would step in. And this is, now in a sense, when Shapiro says, well, you're betraying Christianity, no, you're not betraying Christianity here. Christianity has all of this built in. We are called to, actually it gets more complicated than this, we are called to deal with, we are called to do exactly what Jordan Peterson says. We are called to do exactly what Jordan Peterson says, understanding, however, that there are battles too great for us, and we need a champion for this. So that's one thing. And I want to say another thing that is a lot more complicated. I'll put a link in the notes to a sermon that I wrote of Jacob fighting God by the J book. And John Calvin has a very famous treatment of that, where in fact God is fighting himself with his left hand and his right hand. And I'll put the link to that. Before I was doing videos, I was making blog posts before my sermons, and so my blog actually has a lot of old sermon material on a lot of different things. But this is also something that happens in Christianity, that when I step up to take on a challenge that is too great for me, it's Christ fighting through me by his Spirit. This gets represented in the New Testament when, for example, the apostles do healings. Well, now the Apostle Paul will rend his clothes because a Greek town will say, "Oh my goodness, this is, these are gods who have come." And Paul says, "I am not a god." This is a new idea where God works through me, and again, corporately, in terms of the church, God works through us. So this either or that Ben Shapiro just put in here really isn't an either or. It's a both and, both that Christ is our champion who fights dragons too great for us, but also Christ fights through us when we challenge things that we, and in Christian tradition, we often do lose, that will in fact take us. But Christ works through me. And this is where on Twitter I got into the question of agency, that, well, how does God work and how do we work? Well, our ability to language this, to represent these things in language, is limited. In a sense, our ability to do it internally is greater. So, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in terms of a man with tremendous gifts of language, but it meant something when someone who had high status, when he was at the front of the march and he knew that the police dogs and the fire hose would attack him. Okay? And so what Christians say is that Christ does this through us. All right?
I actually agree from a Judaic point of view with everything that you say, because for me, it's about accepting responsibility for my own sins on myself, and I don't have the ability to say that there is...
So accepting responsibility is in the hierarchy both of Christianity and Judaism. The question is, where does it lie in the hierarchy, and how do hierarchies work?
The suffering servant, the suffering Lamb of God, who sacrificed himself to relieve me of my sins, and therefore give me a fair shot at life.
Yeah, well, okay, that's a really good objection, I think, and I think that there's a fair bit of confusion about that in the Christian community.
I don't know if it would be confusion, yes, but thousands of years of conversation, really.
For example, so I would say that perspective is more explicitly Protestant, and then I would put the Catholics next to that, but then I would put the Orthodox types fairly far away from that.
And I'm not sure that's fair to the Orthodox. Again, by virtue of my Western education, I am the least familiar with the Orthodox. So maybe if Jonathan and I would get together, we'd talk about that. The Orthodox, I think, really have tried to, it isn't, like I said, it isn't an either or in any of the Christian traditions. And now the different traditions might have different nuances in it. But so there's emphases in traditions, but there's also emphases by definition of context. And this has been known in Christianity right from the beginning. And this, in fact, is related in the book of James, where in the book of James, someone basically says, they separate faith and works. And James says, I'll show you my faith by my works. Now, this gets to be a big bone of contention in the Protestant Reformation, which maybe I'll talk about a little bit later.
Which is why so many Orthodox Christians, I think, have been interested in what I'm saying, because their sense, and this is where my knowledge of Christian theology starts to run out, because like I'm not an expert on, in the doctrinal differences.
Right.
Their sense is that it's the imitation that's of primary importance. Now, it's a weird thing, because even in classical Christianity, you have, let's say Protestant Christianity, you have this idea that, well, Christ died to save us all from our sins, and so we're already redeemed. But that doesn't alleviate the moral burden, weirdly enough, because you'd think it should. So there's this paradox. And I think I think part of the reason for that, this is an extraordinarily complicated thing, but in the Brothers Karamazov.
Okay, this is going to go into, let me back that up and take it apart a little bit.
Weirdly enough, because you'd think it should. So there's this paradox. The classical Christianity, you have, let's say Protestant Christianity, you have this idea that, well, Christ died to save us all from our sins, and so we're already redeemed. But that doesn't alleviate the moral burden, weirdly enough, because you'd think it should.
I'll talk a little bit about the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was, my conversations with Ron Dart got interrupted with the death of my sister, but I very much want to get back to having some more conversations with Ron Dart. We were talking about Erasmus, we're talking about Luther. Luther was a scholar / pastor. Erasmus wasn't really a pastor. John Calvin was a scholar / pastor. The Reformation was mostly kicked off by scholars / pastors. Pastors often have different gifts. I talked about gifts a little bit already. A lot of the leaders of the Reformation, Zwingli, Calvin, Luther, those are the main ones that most people know. These were very gifted scholars, and they were also pastors. And again, pastors tend to work in terms of applied. Luther wanted to reform the Roman Catholic Church, and a conflict developed that led to a very bad schism. This stuff gets tough to talk about because you have the tribes, and the 500-year-old conflict is still alive in the world. And basically, what a lot of the reformers saw was that there was a sense among many people of the church in certain areas. Part of the difficulty is to talk about the church is that you've got the church in Germany, you've got the church in Italy, you've got the church in France, you've got the church in England. The Western church was a very large thing. It's even larger today. But some of the pastors were troubled by the fact that it seemed that, well, you go to confession, you take the mass, you do all these things, and well, then your sins are done. And so you had some people for whom that used the work of the church to abdicate responsibility for a moral life. You had other people for whom the work of the church, the mass, the penance, the sacraments, all of this wasn't alleviating their consciences. That was Luther, okay? And so you always had both problems, and the church always, in fact, has both problems. And many people try to address these problems in different ways. Sometimes it's by nagging and scolding that people try to get at this. And so from way before the Protestant Reformation, the church has been trying to figure out representations of this dynamic, that on one hand, the work of Christ was once and for all. You find that in the book of Hebrews, and that Christ was the final sacrifice for our sins. Paul goes on into that and talks about, okay, but let that not be a license for living in the world. And now then you're going to get into this dynamic about being in Christ versus being in the world. And so all the way back to the New Testament period, the church has been working to represent this in language, represent this in ministry in terms of what priests and laity and churches and this community of Christ does, and how we talk about it, how we feel about it. This area that they're getting into is not anywhere near as settled. It's in fact throughout the church, and I've joked about this before in previous videos. Someone, let's say, goes to a Billy Graham crusade in the 50s, and you know, they're going to go down the aisle, and you know, just as I am without one plea, you know, okay, and then Jesus would forgive me everything. Wonderful. And then they say, well, then I'm just going to go out and live as I did. Well, Heidelberg Catechism, almost all doctrinal positions say, no, you can't do that. But how do you language that? And that's really where all of the theological conversations have been trying to do, to language that relationship. Because the church wants to say a number of things which sound contradictory. On one hand, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was sufficient to redeem the world. That's what the Bible says. You need to live in alignment with that sacrifice. Similar to what Peterson is saying. But what happens when we fall short? Is our falling short simply a matter of our lack of power? Well, that's different than our lack of motivation. To what degree are we responsible for the ways that we fall short? So you know, when I look at Peterson's ministry, and I you know, again, I've said this many times, I think he's being used by the Holy Spirit to move ahead the kingdom of God and God's church, quite frankly. That's what I think Jordan Peterson is doing. He's an unauthorized exorcist. He is casting out demons in Jesus' name, but he's not part of the disciples. I think it's a good analogy for who Peterson is and what he's doing. But you have the question. So Peterson is going out there and people are cleaning their room. Okay, they're cleaning their room. And maybe they're getting into a 12-step program and they're dealing with drinking too much, or you know, their drug habit or their porn habit, and they're working on all these things. What happens when they fail? And in fact, this issue, not far from the conversation, let's say, that Peterson had with Joe Rogan, which is dealing with the new American religion of what I call progressive liberation, and some new Western religion. And if you look at McClay's, I should pull that up. I did it in a video a long time ago. Where will someone who is destroying the earth by their patriarchy or their burning of fossil fuels or their what have you, where will they find redemption in progressive liberationism? They won't. It's purely a works righteousness religion. And that's when we begin to get into these dichotomies. And so if you're contrasting, let's say, a works righteousness religion of progressive liberationism, we'll contrast that with, let's say, the redemption offered by Christianity. And that then gets represented into stories, it gets represented into theological language, and all of our talking about it is an attempt to represent it, but then hopefully all that representation and all that talking and all that yakking and the sermons and the liturgy and the art and all of those things will finally get boiled down into lives that imitate Christ. And this is where I get into, within my own tradition, do Christians bring in the kingdom or do Christians bear witness with the kingdom? I'm on the bear witness side, because finally we believe that it is God who brings in the kingdom and we bear witness to it.
So there's this paradox, and I think I think part of the reason for that, this is an extraordinarily complicated thing, but in the Brothers Karamazov, Christ comes back to earth.
Right.
And in Seville during the Spanish Inquisition, and so he's doing his miracles and raising people from the dead and like being all messianic, and the first thing that happens is the Inquisitor arrests him, throws him in prison, and then comes to visit him and basically says, look, the last thing we need after setting up this church for 2,000 years is you. You're a lot of trouble. You've put a moral burden on human beings that's too much for them to bear. And so what we've done is watered it down and put some intermediaries in place so that the moral demand that your example required doesn't just crush people into nothingness, right? So every ideal is a judge.
Right.
So then you have the ultimate ideal. That's the ultimate judge. And from the Inquisitor's point of view, that judge was too much.
The Apostles' Creed. Jesus shall come to judge the living and the dead. Peterson gets this dead on right.
It was too demanding. And so I think there's so the Inquisitor goes through all this argument and says, we're going to have to, get rid of you again because you're just too much to bear. And so Christ listens and doesn't say anything. And then just when the Inquisitor stands to leave, Christ kisses him on the lips, and the Inquisitor turns white in shock and then leaves, but he leaves the door open. And that's the brilliant ending of Dostoyevsky's piece.
The Grand Inquisitor, yeah.
Yeah, and what makes him such a genius, because he basically says something like, well, look, the Catholic Church did reduce the burden, and it is corrupt in the way that earthly organizations are likely to be corrupt. And it does allow an out, which is, well, you can put your sins on Christ, let's say, and that alleviates your moral burden, but it still keeps the damn door open.
Well,
And it keeps the door open for Jesus. Well, why? It's the openness to God, number two. It's for Jesus to get back out there into the world. It's for all of the alarming power. Many people today look at Jesus, especially, let's say, in the main line. I don't want to name names in this way, because many people look on Jesus and say, well, he's the great example. All right. But as Peterson rightly notes here, the ultimate model is the ultimate judge. And that example will crush you. And so what the church does, why does Jesus heal people? Why does Jesus not tell people who are sick, go out and heal yourself? Well, you need to eat better and you need to exercise. Well, why didn't Jesus instruct his disciples in making penicillin? Surely an antibiotic in the first century would have changed human history. The miracles of Jesus are shorthand representations of the kingdom of God. What does that mean? Well, Jesus is the example. Well, we go out and heal people, but I've prayed for many people. For only been very limited cases in which, I want to be careful what I say. Many of the people I pray for die. Jesus is all of those things, okay? And all of those things via context are within hierarchies, okay? It's a brilliant story by Dostoyevsky. And that story illuminates so many things, including there've been stories like this. Jesus walks into a church. There's a reason they killed Jesus. In the midst of a very hot culture war, where both sides hated each other enough to literally kill each other. That's what was happening in Jesus' culture war. They couldn't agree on hardly anything except that they didn't want Jesus around anymore, so they killed him. Jesus' own people, the Romans, they all collaborated. Tiny little group of people, Jesus' friends, they were grief-stricken. Many, many people shouted, "Crucify him." That's what's in the story. Jesus is hard to take. And as a Christian, you begin to learn this. And these questions, I talked about it in my eulogy. Mary, Lazarus, Martha, friends of Jesus. Jesus loved them. They sent word to Jesus, Lazarus is sick. You've cured all these other people. Come and heal him so he doesn't die. Jesus tarries. He doesn't go. Why doesn't he go? He's going to let Lazarus die. He's doing this intentionally. He tells his disciples he's going to do this intentionally. The sisters are not only grief-stricken, they're angry at Jesus. Why didn't you get here to save him? Our brother died because of you, and our world is torn up, and we're in grief. And Jesus doesn't get to the tomb and say, "Oh, no problem." Jesus gets to the tomb, and he's troubled in spirit, and he's angry. Well, what's he angry at? Is he angry at the Father? He's angry at death. Well, there's a little drama being played out there. Now, could Mary and Martha call Lazarus from the tomb? It's a good question. Via the Holy Spirit. Can people be raised from the dead? Read Craig Keener's 2-volume large book on miracles. There are stories of Christians raising other Christians from the dead still today. These things do happen. And I know some of you are going to say, well, I'm done listening to Vanderclyffe. Well, there you go. But this is how this stuff works together. There's hierarchies. And so Jesus is a lot to handle. That's what makes him the King of Kings. You don't stroll into a king's room and not be nervous, because he has the power of life and death.
Well, this is why I think it's really fascinating, having spent a lot of time with Christian theologians in the past couple of years writing this book, is that the original conceit, I think, when you talk with people who are Christian and Jewish and you have sort of interfaith conversations, the original one-sentence conceit and the difference between them is that what you hear from Jews is Judaism is acts-based and Christianity is faith-based.
This is something that has been taught a lot by Christians. And if you read someone like N.T. Wright, he and Scott McKnight, a lot of contemporary Christian scholars will challenge that this low resolution take on the two religions is actually unfair. Just as a number of scholars today will take on kind of the Sunday school teaching by Protestants of Catholics that Protestantism is faith-based and Roman Catholicism is works-based. I think, in all fairness, all of that is quite low resolution. The picture from the Hebrew Scriptures is far more complex. And N.T. Wright, in looking at how Paul lays this out in the New Testament, says it's far more complex than the Jews were works righteousness, and here we're saved by faith. A lot of that is coming through Luther. That's in a sense Luther reading back onto the Bible his conflict he's having with the Roman Catholic Church. Was it fair to the whole church at that point? Probably not. Was it true of some of the individuals that Luther was dealing with? Probably. Churches and people and moments are complex like that.
Christianity is about the acceptance of Christ. When you accept Christ, then you've accepted what you need to accept, and everything flows therefrom. And Judaism says it's not just about accepting God, it's all these mitzvot, right? There are all these commandments that you have to do, and these are what perfect you as a human being. It's the performance of these commandments, accepting God's sovereignty because he's the one who gave the commandments, but you actually have to act in the world, and if you don't act in the world, then you haven't fulfilled your responsibility in the world.
This could also be an argument why you could have, although I know you wouldn't be thrilled with them per se, you could have Jewish atheists in that they believe that it's just their actions here.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
So this is why Jews have had and I think most Christians believe this too. The idea of having a moral atheist is not really a difficult idea.
Yeah.
It's the idea of having a system built on atheism that's completely immoral and will fall apart almost immediately, and the idea of having a moral system built on atheism, if you examine your atheism closely enough, I think falls apart. I think that moral atheism is basically you separating your morality from your atheism and then ignoring your atheism in pursuit of the morality, which is, well, you can live fine that way, that's fine, but I don't think that that's psychologically sustainable if you actually examine the core of your ideas. But with that said, I think that Christianity, after its original millenarian viewpoint, when Christianity first came about, the idea of Christ on earth was that he had ushered in the Messianic era, because it was a new era, it was a new day, and then it turns out that people looked around and went, well, this looks a lot like the old day, right? Not that much has changed. And so what?
This is a key, and I'm not going to have time to get into this today. This video is already getting long. I still got honeydews to do. But this is a key point right here. To understand exactly what Jesus changed. Is it relational? Is it ontological? What does the resurrection mean? And again, I recommend N.T. Wright, terrific Christian scholar, also a good historian. Excuse me. And I know this is a question that Peterson grapples with, and in terms of Peterson trying to figure out Christianity and how it goes, because, well, if Jesus, and this is where you get into the realm of imagination, okay, Jesus rises from the dead. Jesus didn't show up at Pilate's palace and say, "How do I look now?" He doesn't do that. Why not? Appears to his disciples, and he ascends. Jesus is playing a different game. Well, what game is Jesus playing? Well, that's exactly what the Apostle Paul is trying to figure out, and what the Apostle Paul is working through, and what the church continues to work through the church fathers and on through the history of Christian theology. What is Jesus doing? How does this change the world? How does Jesus' resurrection impact me? Well, now we're going to get into stories and how that flows. Maybe I'll listen to a little bit more of, but I really got to wrap this up. And again, I'm leaving. My wife has some things she has to do tomorrow afternoon. I might have more time for more videos before I go. We'll see. Still got to pack.
What changed was our spiritual status. That was the new redefinition of the.
Okay, what changes our spiritual status? What do you mean by spirit? And this is in many ways some of the conversation that you have between Christians who say, well, I anticipate the continuity of my consciousness after death and my physical resurrection, just as Jesus' physical resurrection. So spiritual is a word that fudges and a word that punts here. But I understand exactly why I used it, because that's the word that we use.
The Messianic era is that the what Christ had brought to earth was a new spirit, right? He brought a new spirit into the earth, and he'd cleansed people of their sins and given them a fresh shot at life, basically.
Yeah.
And that in doing so, he'd changed the nature of how things work. Well, Judaism basically said, well, we never thought that nature changed in the first place, right? That's something different. And so
if you read, for example, the book of Acts, when Paul is going throughout the diaspora and the empire and goes into synagogues and he keeps splitting them, and some of the members of the synagogue listen to Paul and say, yeah, I think that Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise, and others say, nah, I ain't buying it. That resurrection thing, ain't buying it.
Ironically enough, I think one of the sources of Christian anti-Semitism over time is an attempt to distinguish what makes Christianity different from Judaism other than Christ.
There's a reason a number of Jewish scholars have difficulty with a number of the books in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John. Part of that has to do with, we know that early on, so when we read the Bible and we're reading through the Gospels, the way stories work is that we feel like we're there in the moment with Jesus. The Gospels were some of the New Testament books written later than some of the epistles. What was going on in the communities that were writing these? Well, one of the things that we know was that this new group of people that eventually became called Christians found themselves in conflict with people in the broader Roman Empire, the pagans, but also in conflict with their Jewish relatives and family and friends. And you see this worked out early in the book of Acts. So, for example, in the Gospel of John, when the Gospel of John keeps talking about the Jews, well, John the Apostle was a Jew, Jesus was a Jew, good part of the early church are Jews. Why you're calling them the Jews? Well, probably because you're writing in a context, let's assume the Johannine community, maybe in the region of Ephesus. If you watch my adult Sunday school stuff, I get into some of these things. They're distinguishing the Jewish population from the Christian population already, because initially Christianity was this Jewish sect, and then it continued to grow amongst the pagans, but not nearly as much amongst the Jewish population, the Jewish diaspora population. And so some of the language, some of the representation of that early conflict gets into the canon. Now, it doesn't mean it's just that by nature of the language. This then gets picked up by later generations, and again, by context, you have hierarchies form. Anti-Semitism develops, very long, sad history. But part of the reason the language got going that way was because there was initially quite a bit of conflict, not only between, part of the difficulty is that early on, Paul is a Jew. but he's a diaspora Jew. That's a little different from the Jews living in Judea. Okay, and you see that conflict in Acts chapter 6, for example, where there's a language conflict. So there's conflicts all over, and those conflicts, the record of those conflicts is there in the Bible in many ways. Often only scholars see it because, again, so often we read the Bible out of our own context. And again, this is all this kind of stuff I talk about in my adult Sunday school class, which is online over on the church channel. I don't put it on this channel because I kind of keep the two streams a little separate. But if you're interested in that, you can go subscribe to the Livingstone CRC YouTube channel and find it there. And the link is also in the comments.
Because Christianity and Judaism, in most of their main philosophies, have an awful lot in common. It's interesting. I just interviewed a fellow named John MacArthur, who's a major pastor, major Christian theologian. I interviewed him a couple of days ago for our Sunday special. And this came up. I asked him, so where do you think the differences are between Christianity and Judaism? And he basically said, Jesus. Right? That's the difference. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the mostly honest answer, because when I hear Christian theologians try to distinguish Judaism from Christianity, what they say about Judaism I find to be not accurate as to what Judaism actually says.
Right, because Christians who aren't Jews don't know Judaism, and vice versa. That's just what it means to be living in an asylum, to be living in a tribe.
And when I hear Jews try to distinguish Christianity from Judaism, I think that, and I'm not saying they're the same thing, because they're not, obviously, they're different belief systems, but in terms of the underlying value system, the reason that we say Judeo-Christian value system is because in terms of the value system itself, the commonalities are overwhelming. They're overwhelming. The differences are mostly doctrinal and historical, and in terms of what you think God, I think that Christians read back in an Acts-based version of their own lives through a variety of mechanisms, whether they say, well, predestination exists, but in order to show that if I were really elect, I would be acting this way, right? That is an act.
Now, that's the Weber thesis about Calvinism that he talked to John MacArthur. MacArthur is a Reformed minister. Now, even if you get into the Reformed community, the Christian Reformed Church, which is where I'm at, it's a little different from John MacArthur. There'd be some Christian Reformed people that'd be very much like John MacArthur. There'd be some Christian Reformed people that John MacArthur wouldn't be their cup of tea, so on and so forth. So again, these religious communities are enormously complicated, and there's all kind of nuance about it. Now, what Shapiro says here, if you look at my sermons, you'll notice that many of my sermons, again, those are on the church channel, have a structure, and it's misery, deliverance, gratitude. And the reason I always forefront that, not only is the basic structure of the Heidelberg Catechism, one of our doctrinal statements, but to me, it helps people work through this question that Peterson and Shapiro are grappling with. Well, where does the completed work of Christ interface with my ongoing time-based work in the world? Well, one conceptual scheme that I think is very helpful for that is misery. I screw things up. I'm a sinner. Everything I do is tainted by all kinds of stuff within me. Deliverance. Christ has accomplished my redemption. I can feel secure in his work, that rather than insecure based on my own performance and the ways I mess up, the ways that I fall short of Christ's model for me. Then the question is, well, what does that mean in terms of how I should live? Should I go ahead and sin greater, as Paul says in the New Testament, and meganoita, Paul says in Greek? Hell no, in a sense. Gratitude is how we respond to the work of Christ. Well, what do we do in gratitude? It's in that place that we begin to live into the model of Christ, that we begin to become little Christ, that go all the way back to the video that I began this for, where, whether or not we know anything about Jordan Peterson, whether, whatever church silo we're in, that now out of gratitude, I bear witness to his kingdom. I pick up the heavy burden, and as heavy a burden as I can carry it uphill, but I do so with the assurance that, in fact, the world isn't all up to me. Now, that's a psychologically, that's a real risky thing to imagine that it's all up to me. Partly often because it isn't true, but also because what if I fail and it's all up to me? Well, then suddenly sometimes you can flip and say, well, screw this, I can't do anything. What gratitude helps is something similar to, if you've ever watched Saving Private Ryan. I mean, this little squad, they get an order from the higher ups that they have to go find Private Ryan and rescue him because they couldn't manage the thought that all of his brothers would die. So they go, and this little squad, Tom Hanks is the captain of the squad, they go through the D-Day battle, and they finally get to Private Ryan, and they're doing everything in life to save him because that's their mission, and they're all going to give their life for him. And then Tom Hanks looks at Private Ryan and says, "Earn it." Now work that through theologically. And you get a sense of what gratitude is within my tradition. Okay, this is what Christ has done for you. What won't you do for him? That's powerful. And this has been part of what's energized Calvinism. I won't speak for or against the other traditions, but what's energized my tradition to say, he who would give his own son for you, what will you do for him? Wow. There's a story. There's the mythos. There's the thing that governs. Now, I'd like to keep going. I'm just going to note this here at 1:11:24 in the Reuben thing. But I'm kind of out of time. I've got to go to Costco. I've got to go to Costco. Costco closes early on Saturday. But I hope these two videos help. Maybe I'll get some time tomorrow to continue because there's so much in these videos that I want to digest. I'll take a computer with me to my mother's house. I'll be back living in my mother's basement. Bit of solidarity to all you buccos living in your mother's basement. And if I get a chance to make some videos or maybe do some writing next week, and I keep thinking that I should probably do a little bit more writing. I don't know if it'll be a blog or if I'd write a little short book for Amazon or something like this. And I'm still always thinking about that. But I'm getting to the point now that I feel like I've got a good enough handle, at least on Peterson. No, I don't have a good enough handle on Jung. I don't have a good enough handle on Nietzsche. I don't have a good enough handle on whole realms of things. But I think at this point, I know Peterson well enough that perhaps I can put some words down on paper. So I hope this was helpful. I know some of you really wanted me to respond to some of this, but there's so much in this video, the Reuben report with Peterson and Shapiro. There's so much here that I can't possibly get into it. And so much of it touches so much of Christian history. So I hope this was helpful.